In a moment that left even her supporters stunned, Sarah Huckabee Sanders completely lost control when confronted with one simple question she couldn't answer. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were live, and the nation watched as her carefully polished image cracked wide open. Her voice, usually measured in calculated tones, rose with sharpness, every word sounding more defensive than the last. Her face flushed red, her jaw tightened, and for a fleeting instant, the mask of composure slipped to reveal raw panic. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. For years, Sanders had made a career out of controlling the narrative, sidestepping the truth with polished sound bites and rehearsed lines. She prided herself on being unshakable, a figure who could spin any question into a victory for her side. But on this day, in this room, her confidence began to unravel in real time. The audience murmured as her words stumbled over each other, half-formed defenses colliding into contradictions. The silence that followed each of her outbursts was deafening. Reporters shifted in their seats, eyebrows raised. Even political allies shifted uncomfortably, watching as the once untouchable Sanders became visibly rattled. The tension was thick, electric, like the air before a storm breaks. Every camera lens zoomed closer, every microphone strained for the next sound, because what was unfolding wasn't just another exchange. It was a collapse in slow motion, and yet, for all the chaos swirling around her, there was another figure in the room. Calm, steady, unflinching. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. She simply waited, like a storm held back, timing each word for maximum impact. Her eyes never left Sanders, and in that unblinking focus, you could sense the shift. Power quietly sliding from the flustered governor to the woman across from her. Sanders tried to regain control, throwing out sharp accusations and dismissive lines. But it was too late. The room could already feel what was coming. It wasn't just a question anymore, it was a test, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders was failing. But what Jasmine Crockett said next didn't just stop Sanders in her tracks, it shattered the entire facade. The confrontation didn't erupt in a vacuum. It unfolded beneath the glaring lights of a committee room, the kind of setting where reputations are made or broken in seconds. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, every major network tuned in, ready to broadcast each word across the country. Staffers shuffled papers, reporters whispered predictions, and the air carried that unmistakable heaviness of expectation. Everyone thought they knew how this would play out. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the seasoned political operator, would glide through with her usual talking points, while challengers would fade into the background. But Sanders' presence here was about more than just answering questions. She had built her brand on the image of calm, conservative leadership, the reliable face of discipline and poise for her party. Every appearance was a chance to reinforce that narrative, to remind supporters that she was unshakable, immune to the storms of scrutiny. Yet that very image was now hanging by a thread. Because when the cameras turned on, America wasn't just watching Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the politician. They were measuring Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the person, and whether the mask she wore could withstand even a single crack. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, and her very presence changed the equation. Crockett had gained a reputation as a sharp, fearless voice, someone who could cut through political theater with one pointed question. For weeks, clips of her fiery exchanges had been circulating online, turning her into a rising star among progressives who were hungry for someone willing to speak plainly in a sea of rehearsed spin. She represented a new kind of political figure, bold, unapologetic, and unwilling to be intimidated by power. That contrast was everything. On one side, Sanders, the establishment, polished but predictable, clinging to carefully rehearsed lines. On the other, Crockett, unafraid, unpredictable, armed not with talking points but with a determination to expose hypocrisy. The collision was inevitable, and the entire country was about to witness what happens when those two worlds collide, under the harshest lights imaginable. Culturally, this was more than just a committee clash. It was a mirror held up to America's broader struggle: truth versus spin, accountability versus evasion, dignity versus arrogance. Viewers watching from living rooms and phones weren't tuning in for policy jargon. They were waiting for validation, for someone to finally pierce the armor of political hypocrisy that had gone unchallenged for too long. And as Sanders adjusted her microphone, offering that tight smile she had perfected in press rooms, the anticipation crackled, like static. Her team expected smooth sailing, but Crockett's supporters were already buzzing online, waiting to see if she would seize the moment. The hashtags were primed, the social media feeds braced, as if the digital world already sensed something seismic was about to occur. Sanders opened with her usual confidence, the tone rehearsed, the words familiar. For a brief moment it seemed like just another exchange, predictable, controlled, forgettable. But then Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, her question sharp, and the first ripple passed through the room. Eyes widened, cameras refocused, and Sanders' expression faltered ever so slightly. The room thought this would be just another routine exchange, but the stakes were about to explode. To understand why Sarah Huckabee Sanders unraveled so spectacularly, in that room, you have to go back to the years she spent standing behind the podium as White House press secretary. Those press briefings became infamous, not because of their clarity, but because of how masterfully she could spin, dodge, and defend the indefensible. She was the architect of obfuscation, the public face of an administration that thrived on distortion. With a calm, straight face, she could take the most outrageous action and repackage it as routine, as justified, as even noble. And for a while, it worked. Reporters learned quickly that asking a direct question rarely led to a direct answer. Instead, Sanders would twist the premise, attack the questioner, or pivot entirely to unrelated talking points. When confronted with facts, she dismissed them as partisan attacks. When pressed for clarity, she leaned on aggression, scolding the press for daring to push too hard. Her reputation wasn't for honesty or transparency, but for her ability to stonewall with a confidence so steady it almost seemed believable. Almost. And yet, beneath the surface of her polished delivery, contradictions piled up. She condemned politicians from the opposing party for their personal failings while excusing, minimizing, or outright denying far worse behavior from her own allies. She attacked Democrats for a lack of family values while defending the most brazen moral lapses from her leader. She lectured about civility while standing behind insults, slurs, and cruelty broadcast directly from the Oval Office. It was the kind of hypocrisy that didn't just bend the truth. It broke it, shattered it, and then demanded others pretend the shards were still whole. One glaring example came when she lashed out at critics who dared question her administration's handling of immigrant families at the border. With a rehearsed tone of indignation, she accused opponents of hating America, of politicizing tragedy, of undermining law and order. Yet the very policies she defended were the same ones tearing families apart, leaving children in cages. The same Sanders who spoke of Christian values and protecting families became the voice that normalized cruelty against the most vulnerable. Another moment seared itself into the public memory when she accused the press of spreading fake news after they documented lies from the administration she served. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She stood at the podium, insisting the media couldn't be trusted, while later admitting under oath in the Mueller investigation that she had fabricated claims to defend the president. She hadn't just spun, she had lied outright. And even then, she brushed it aside, offering no apology, no accountability. This pattern defined her career. Sanders wielded hypocrisy as a shield, certain that sheer confidence could turn falsehoods. into facts. She embodied the double standard, demanding respect while showing none, insisting on integrity while discarding it, cloaking herself in morality while defending corruption. That legacy followed her into her governorship. She presented herself as the strong, steady leader of Arkansas, touting herself as a protector of conservative values. Yet the contradictions persisted. She railed against big government while expanding her own powers. She condemned cancel culture while pushing policies that silenced voices she disagreed with. She criticized radical elites while surrounding herself with the same political insiders she once pretended to reject. And it was with that same inflated confidence that she entered the committee room where Jasmine Crockett was waiting. To Sanders, this was routine. Another chance to dominate headlines, to brush off criticism, to put her opponent in their place with practiced dismissiveness. She had faced down national reporters, adversarial Democrats, and countless controversies. In her mind, Crockett would be no different, just another ambitious lawmaker she could swat away with a smirk and a soundbite. But what Sanders didn't realize was that the very tactics that once shielded her had become her greatest vulnerability. The country had grown weary of the doublespeak. Viewers weren't just watching for spin anymore, they were watching for the moment. When someone would finally call it out, pierce through it, and reveal the hollow core beneath the confidence. In that room, Sarah Huckabee Sanders carried the weight of her contradictions like a hidden burden. Every smirk, every dismissive word, every flash of arrogance was built on years of hypocrisy that could collapse under the right pressure. She believed she could control the story as she always had. She believed she could out-talk, outmaneuver, outspin. But Sanders had underestimated who she was up against. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in the halls of Congress, before her words could make a governor tremble, she was a young woman growing, up in Texas, navigating the weight of expectations and the sting of systemic inequities. Her story is not one of privilege or entitlement, but of grit, persistence, and the kind of determination that only comes from living close to the struggles she would one day fight against. Born into a working-class family, Crockett knew early on what it meant to stretch a dollar, to feel the limits imposed by circumstance, and to witness firsthand how unfairly opportunity could be distributed. It was this reality that pushed her toward education with a relentless drive. She excelled, not because doors were handed to her, but because she refused to let them remain closed. College was not just an academic pursuit. It was survival, a way forward, a means of carving out space in a world that often seemed eager to deny her one. And then came law school, a crucible where she sharpened her mind, her voice, and her sense of justice. In classrooms filled with debate, she learned not just to argue but to expose, not just to persuade but to reveal the truth hiding beneath layers of polished rhetoric. As an attorney, Crockett's focus wasn't on padding her resume with high-paying corporate cases. She chose instead to fight for those society often left behind. Criminal defense work put her directly in the path of injustice. Young men and women facing a system stacked against them, families on the brink, people with no champion to shield them. In the courtroom, she became known for her clarity. No wasted words, no hesitation, no theatrics for their own sake. She spoke directly, plainly, and powerfully. Judges leaned in, juries listened, and her clients, people who often felt invisible, finally felt seen. But Crockett wasn't content to remain confined to the courtroom. She stepped into activism, lending her voice to protests, rallies, and community movements that demanded dignity and accountability. From voting rights to police brutality, she stood with those who needed more than slogans. They needed someone willing to take the microphone and say out loud what others were afraid to admit. It was in these spaces that her reputation grew. Jasmine Crockett wasn't afraid. She wasn't polished into blandness. She wasn't rehearsed into safe neutrality. She was raw, real, and fearless. By the time she entered politics, Crockett was already battle-tested. The Texas state legislature gave her a stage, and she wasted no time using it. She clashed with those who sought to strip away rights, delivering fiery rebukes that went viral not because they were performative, but because they were unflinchingly honest. Clips of her standing tall, unbothered by heckles or dismissive smirks, began to circulate across social media. For many who felt voiceless, she became a symbol, proof that someone inside the system was willing to speak the language of truth rather than politics. That same energy carried her to Washington, where her entrance into Congress was anything but quiet. While some newcomers might shrink under the marble columns and the weight of history, Crockett brought the same clarity she had in courtrooms and protest lines. She didn't soften her edge. She didn't trade conviction for convenience. And soon she was carving out a reputation as one of the sharpest interrogators on Capitol Hill. She knew how to ask the question that sliced through rehearsed talking points, how to wait in silence until the weight of the truth crushed evasions. And here was the deeper power. Crockett didn't just question for the sake of performance. She questioned on behalf of the people who had shaped her life, working families, immigrants, the marginalized, the overlooked. Her tone carried their frustration. Her words carried their dignity. Her resolve carried their hope. She wasn't just a politician in those moments. She was a vessel, a voice for the everyday people who rarely get a microphone in rooms of power. So when she found herself face to face with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't some random pairing of adversaries in a committee room. It was something bigger, something that felt almost inevitable. Sanders, the embodiment of spin, hypocrisy, and entitlement, sitting across from Crockett, the embodiment of clarity, truth, and resilience. One represented the old order of politics, polished lies presented as leadership. The other represented a new wave, fearless, authentic, unwilling to yield. For Sanders, this may have felt like routine, but for Crockett, it was something else entirely. Every struggle she had endured, every injustice she had witnessed, every word she had spoken in defense of the voiceless had led her here. It was destiny written in tension, carried by history, sharpened by struggle. The audience in that room may not have realized it yet, but a storm was gathering, not one of bluster and spin, but of quiet, calculated force. Crockett had come. Prepared, not just with facts, but with the weight of truth behind her. Sanders still smirked, still carried herself with the arrogance of someone convinced no one could touch her. But that confidence would soon meet its match. And when the moment came, Crockett's preparation met Sanders' weakest spot. The first exchange seemed almost routine. Sanders adjusted her posture, leaned into the microphone, and let out a rehearsed laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. With a steady tone, she delivered her familiar blend of deflection and dismissal, rattling off a list of talking points, as though reading from a script she'd recited 1,000 times before. She spoke of radical agendas, of liberal lies, of the supposed chaos that her leadership alone was preventing. Her words carried that air of smug confidence, the same cadence that once made her seem untouchable behind the White House podium. But the room was already shifting. Reporters exchanged glances, sensing that this was more than the usual back and forth. Crockett sat quietly, her gaze locked on Sanders, her expression calm and unbothered. She didn't flinch, didn't scribble frantic notes, didn't break eye contact. That composure alone began to unsettle Sanders. Politicians thrive on performance, on visible reactions, but Crockett gave her nothing. So Sanders leaned harder into the act. She tried the familiar trick of turning the tables, sneering that the real hypocrisy came from the other side. She accused Democrats of undermining faith, family, and freedom. She dropped the word elitist like a weapon, confident. that the echo of partisan loyalty would shield her from scrutiny. The tone grew sharper, her sentences faster, each phrase meant to overwhelm, to dominate, to drown out. And yet Crockett remained unmoved. When her turn came, she spoke with deliberate calm, her voice low but razor-sharp. She didn't mirror Sanders' volume. She didn't need to. Instead, she dissected the claims one by one, not with lengthy speeches but with piercing questions. Each word landed with surgical precision, and each pause carried the weight of expectation. The silence between her questions made Sanders squirm more than any shouted accusation ever could. The audience felt it too. A hush fell over the room, broken only by murmurs as Crockett's words cut through the haze of spin. Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer, capturing the flicker of unease spreading across Sanders's face. Her practiced rhythm began to falter. She fumbled a statistic, contradicted herself in the next sentence, and then tried to mask it with a forced chuckle. Desperation bled through her confidence. She reached for insults, throwing barbed jabs meant to rattle Crockett, questioning her experience, dismissing her perspective, scoffing at her credibility. But every attempt landed flat. Crockett absorbed them with unshaken dignity, her eyes never wavering. She responded not with counter-insults, but with facts, framed so clearly that the room had no choice but to recognize the contrast: arrogance versus composure, bluster versus truth. By now, the atmosphere had become electric. The tension pressed down on everyone present, an unspoken awareness that something historic was brewing. Reporters scribbled frantically, staffers whispered to one another, and viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. The sense was undeniable. Sanders, once in control of every narrative, was losing this one in real time. Her voice rose again, sharper, tinged with frustration. She pounded the table with her palm, hoping the noise could drown out the logic unraveling her defenses. She called Crockett naive, labeled her questions gotcha games, tried to paint her as another ambitious upstart hungry for attention. But the cracks were widening. Each insult revealed more desperation, each deflection exposed the fragility of her position. And still, Crockett never raised her voice. She leaned forward slightly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, as though she knew what was coming. The contrast was cinematic. One woman unraveling in fury, the other radiating calm strength, her silence speaking louder than any shouted retort. The room braced itself. Sanders, flustered and cornered, was about to face the moment she had spent her entire career trying to avoid, a direct confrontation she could not spin her way out of. The murmurs quieted, the air tightened, and every gaze locked on Crockett as she prepared to deliver the line that would change everything. And then came the sentence that made Sanders snap. The silence that followed Sanders' last insult hung in the air like a suspended note, daring someone to break it. The governor shifted in her seat, her smirk wavering, her hands fidgeting with the papers before her. She expected the silence to work in her favor, a chance for her words to sting. But across the table, Jasmine Crockett was ready. She leaned in slowly, eyes locked, voice steady, and asked the question that would strip away the facade. "Governor, do you really want to talk about hypocrisy?" The words landed like a gavel. Sanders blinked, her lips parting as though to respond. But no sound came. Crockett let the silence linger, letting the weight of the word hang over the room. Then she spoke again, measured, deliberate, each sentence sharper than the last. "You stand here and lecture the rest of us about values, about integrity, about responsibility. But let's remember your record. You defended policies that ripped children from their parents at the border, policies that traumatized families in the name of so-called law and order. And when people asked you about those kids, you looked them in the eye and said it was the fault of their parents, not your administration. That's not leadership. That's cruelty dressed up as spin." A murmur rippled through the room. Sanders's shoulders stiffened, her smile cracking. She adjusted her microphone, forcing a chuckle. "With all due respect," she began, but Crockett cut in, her tone calm but unrelenting. "And when the truth didn't serve your purpose, you didn't hesitate to lie. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. You told this country the FBI rank and file had lost confidence in Director Comey. Under oath, you admitted that wasn't true. You called that a slip of the tongue. No, Governor, that wasn't a slip. That was a choice. You chose deception over honesty, because deception kept your power intact." Gasps echoed across the room. Sanders' face flushed crimson, her jaw tightening. She reached for her water, sipping too quickly, trying to mask the tremor in her hands. She opened her mouth again, but Crockett's words rolled forward like a tide she couldn't stop. "You tell working people you're fighting for them, but every time you had the chance to stand up for health care, for wages, for fairness, you sided with corporations and donors. You mocked Democrats for being out of touch while cozying up to the very elites you claim to despise. And now you lecture us about values?" The room was no longer murmuring. It was silent, spellbound. Even Sanders' allies shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward the cameras that were catching every expression, every flinch. Sanders tried to rally, her voice cracking as she raised it. "This is nothing but partisan attacks. You—" But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned back, slightly, her voice lower now but sharper. "Governor, you call everything a partisan attack because you can't answer the question. The truth isn't partisan. The truth is the truth. And the truth is that your entire career has been built on demanding accountability from others while refusing to take any for yourself." The words hit like a hammer. Sanders's rebuttal dissolved into stammers, her hand waving in vague dismissal. She tried to redirect, to point back to liberal failures. But the momentum was gone. Governor, who once commanded press rooms with icy composure, was unraveling under the gaze of a calm, unshaken opponent, and Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward once more, her voice tightening with precision. "When you stood at that podium in the White House, you told Americans the media was lying. You said we couldn't trust the free press, even as you spread lies of your own. That wasn't protecting America. That was undermining it. And now you want us to believe you stand for honesty? You want to lecture us about credibility?" Sanders's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, for a lifeline. None came. The audience was transfixed, caught between disbelief and awe. A staffer coughed in the back. A camera shutter clicked. Every sound felt magnified, every second stretched. Crockett let the silence return, her point made, her voice unwavering. Then, with perfect timing, she delivered the line that would reverberate far beyond the room. "You can't lecture America on values, Governor, when you spent your career proving you have none to stand on." The room erupted, not in noise, but in stunned stillness. A collective gasp, the sound of people exhaling as though they'd been holding their breath. Sanders's face contorted, torn between rage and disbelief. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then stammered something inaudible. Her composure was gone. The mask had shattered. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She sat back, composed, dignified, her point delivered with surgical precision. The contrast was undeniable. One woman unraveling in a storm of contradictions, the other radiating calm clarity, untouchable. Sanders tried again, her words stumbling. This is just political theater," she managed, her voice trembling. But no one bought it. The crowd wasn't hearing political theater, they were hearing truth laid bare. Even among her supporters there was a visible shift. Eyes that once beamed with loyalty now flickered with doubt. The governor, who had built her image on control and strength, was now visibly shaken, cornered, stripped of the veneer she had worn for so long, and Crockett's silence was as powerful as her words. She didn't push further, didn't need to. The damage was done. Sanders' unraveling wasn't just apparent, it was complete. The cameras captured every second, every stammer, every drop of sweat. Clips would soon be replayed on every platform, dissected on every network, turned into the kind of viral moment politicians dread. But in the room, in that exact moment, it was simply undeniable. Sarah Huckabee Sanders had lost, not to volume, not to aggression, but to the simple, unflinching force of truth. Crockett remained composed, her dignity intact, her voice steady, as she offered one final sentence. A quiet end to a devastating takedown. America deserves better than excuses. It deserves leaders who can tell the truth. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Sanders lowered her gaze, fumbling with her papers, desperate to escape the weight of the moment. But there was no escape. The truth had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. But the real shock came not in the room, but in the reaction that followed across the country. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words landed, the tremors were immediate. But it wasn't until minutes later, when the clips hit social media, that the earthquake began. Within an hour, hashtags blazed across platforms. Crockett clapback, truth over spin, and most damning of all, Sanders meltdown. Twitter threads dissected the exchange line by line, looping Crockett's mic drop delivery alongside Sanders' crimson face and stammering rebuttals. TikTok edits set the moment to dramatic music, looping the exact instant Sanders' expression faltered, her confidence collapsing in real time. Memes sprouted like wildfire. One image showed Sanders clutching her notes with the caption, "When the spin cycle breaks." Another placed Crockett in gladiator armor, standing tall over a crumbling coliseum, Sanders fleeing in the background. Teenagers who had never watched a committee hearing in their lives were suddenly quoting Crockett, turning her words into slogans on Instagram stories and Snapchat filters. Cable news, always hungry for drama, pounced. That night, every panel show led with the clip. On MSNBC, commentators praised Crockett as the rising star of accountability politics. CNN looped the takedown on repeat, each analyst marveling at how Sanders lost her composure so spectacularly. Even Fox, typically a safe haven for Sanders, couldn't avoid showing the footage, though they scrambled to reframe it, calling the confrontation partisan theater. But even in their attempt to spin, the cracks showed. Viewers could see it for themselves. Sanders didn't look strong. She looked rattled. Activists quickly turned the moment into a rallying cry. Progressive leaders tweeted their admiration for Crockett's courage, calling her a truth-teller America desperately needs. Civil rights groups praised her for holding Sanders accountable for her record on immigrant families and media integrity. One viral thread described Crockett as the antidote to political gaslighting, a phrase that caught fire and spread across timelines. And then came the celebrities. Comedians clipped the footage into sketches within 24 hours. Late night. Hosts opened their monologues with Sanders' meltdown, exaggerating her stammering response to roaring laughter. Musicians, actors, and influencers reposted Crockett's words with fire emojis and applause. The cultural zeitgeist had chosen a winner, and it wasn't the governor of Arkansas. For Sanders, the backlash was brutal. Conservative pundits tried to rally to her defense, but the cracks were undeniable. Online forums filled with uneasy comments from her own base. Why did she lose her cool like that? She looked weak. If she can't handle Crockett, how's she supposed to handle bigger battles? The woman who had built her reputation as unflappable suddenly looked fragile, human, breakable. Headlines the next morning captured the carnage. Sanders stumbles in face of Crockett's fire. Governor melts down as Crockett exposes hypocrisy. Even international outlets picked it up. framing it as a symbol of America's shifting political winds, the old guard losing ground to a new generation, unafraid to confront them head-on. The ripple effects spread beyond Sanders herself. Political strategists whispered about whether her national ambitions had taken a fatal blow. Some allies tried to brush it off as a bad day, but privately, donors and operatives questioned whether her once solid image could ever recover. In politics, perception is everything, and Sanders had been exposed, not just by Crockett's words, but by her own inability to withstand them. Meanwhile, Crockett's star soared. Her social media following doubled overnight. Grassroots organizations reached out, eager to feature her in upcoming campaigns. Talk shows sent invitations. Commentators compared her poise to Barack Obama's early rise, a figure whose clarity of voice broke through noise and captured a cultural hunger for authenticity. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a symbol, a movement in motion. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from everyday people. Teachers shared the clip with their students as an example of holding power accountable. Parents reposted it with pride, telling their kids that dignity matters more than bluster. Immigrants, workers, and community leaders spoke about seeing themselves in Crockett, not as politicians, but as ordinary people demanding truth. The committee room had been the stage, but the audience was the world. And the verdict was clear. Jasmine Crockett had struck a chord that could not be silenced. And yet, beyond the noise, one deeper truth remained. When the dust settled and the noise began to fade, Jasmine Crockett made something clear. This moment was never just about Sarah Huckabee Sanders. It wasn't even about a single committee hearing. It was about a principle as old as democracy itself, the idea that truth must outlast deception, that dignity must stand taller than arrogance. Crockett didn't frame her words as a personal victory. She didn't bask in the viral fame or relish the downfall of her opponent. Instead, she spoke directly to the heart of the matter. She reminded everyone watching that politics is not theater for the powerful, but a mirror for the people. And when those in power distort that reflection, it is the duty of ordinary voices, the teachers, the workers, the immigrants, the young, the overlooked, to demand clarity. Her strength was not just in exposing Sanders' hypocrisy, but in embodying a deeper truth. You don't need to raise your voice to silence dishonesty. You don't need arrogance to defend dignity. What you need is the courage to stand firm, to call out the contradiction, and to refuse to shrink in the face of bluster. Crockett's poise reminded viewers that integrity is a language understood by all. No spin, no rehearsed line, no power structure can drown it out. And in that silence, when Sanders faltered and the crowd gasped, the lesson was written. Arrogance can roar, but it collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Dignity may speak softly, but it endures. For millions who watched, the confrontation became a mirror of their own struggles. People who had been dismissed in workplaces, ignored in schools, or silenced at dinner tables saw themselves in Crockett's calm defiance. They felt the satisfaction of watching someone stand unflinchingly against hypocrisy, not for applause, but because it was right. That resonance turned the moment from a headline into a parable, a reminder that truth is not fragile. It bends under pressure but never breaks. Sanders represented a familiar kind of power. Polished, certain, armored in confidence but hollow at its core. Crockett represented something far rarer. The quiet conviction that even when outnumbered, the truth is enough. And when those two forces collided, it was arrogance that fractured. That is why the clip spread, not because it was entertaining, but because it was affirming. It affirmed that truth matters, that integrity resonates, that courage has weight. It affirmed that in a country often exhausted by noise, there is still power in clarity. Crockett herself put it best when reflecting afterward. This wasn't about me. It was about the people who deserve honesty, no matter who's in power. Those words echoed across social media, quoted in headlines, written into speeches. They reframed the event not as a clash of personalities, but as a reminder of the stakes for every American watching. And so, as the story settled into memory, one image lingered. Sanders rattled, Crockett resolute. A visual contrast so sharp that no amount of spin could blur it. It was more than politics. It was a lesson, one that would ripple into classrooms, living rooms, and conversations long after the cameras stopped rolling, because if there's one thing history always remembers, it's who stood on the side of truth. Sarah Huckabee. Sanders may have lost her composure in that moment, but Jasmine Crockett gained something far more lasting. Respect, admiration, and a powerful place in the national conversation. What began as another exchange in a committee room became a turning point. Not because of the insults traded, but because hypocrisy finally met its match in the form of unshakable truth. This story is bigger than two names on a screen. It's a reflection of what America demands from its leaders: honesty over spin, courage over cowardice, dignity over arrogance. Sanders's meltdown may trend for a day, but Crockett's composure stands as proof that real strength is measured not by volume, but by integrity. And here's the truth: hypocrisy cannot withstand the weight of honesty. It never has, and it never will. Crockett's words reminded us that, in the end, the facade always shatters, and the truth always finds its way through. If you believe dignity still matters in America, share this story. Be part of the movement that refuses to settle for spin and demands leaders who embody honesty, empathy, and justice. Every share, every comment, every voice adds power to the message that integrity is not negotiable, because this, right here, is what defines us. Not the meltdowns of those clinging to power, but the courage of those who stand against them. And if you thought this clash was unforgettable, just wait until you see what happens in our next video. Another confrontation is already sending shock waves, one that might just make this moment look tame by comparison. Stay with us. The fight for truth is only getting started.